This is the Champion of Democracy Element 3 about the role of the Champion of Democracy in the Great War, led by the efforts of the Doughboys, or American soldiers. Now, the biggest thing to remember is that the Americans were hardly ready to fight in the war, but were desperately needed as manpower now, immediately, and got very little training after being drafted. Russia had just gone through a communist revolution, and they pulled out of the war. Now, they'd been fighting Germany on the Eastern Front, and with them gone, Germany could now concentrate all its forces on the Western Front, on the border of France. Reserves were going to be needed badly if the Allies were going to win, because Germany now had the manpower advantage. They needed to finish the job before the Americans could jump in fresh at the end of the fight. And for a while, it looked like that was going to happen. The first American troops didn't arrive in Europe until 1918, a full year after Congress had declared war on Germany. Even then, we had trouble just getting the troops there through the German U-boat patrols. And even then, once we got them there, we found out pretty quickly that we weren't a dominant fighting force. We were just there to be significant numbers for the Allies who were running out of troops. The first U.S. troops arrived in France and were used as replacements in Allied armies all over Europe, all the way to Siberia. By May 1918, the Germans were 40 miles from Paris. 30,000 Americans were thrown into the fight with the Allies, which was the first time U.S. troops had ever fought in a European war. The French were motivated not by U.S. skill, but by the Doughboys' enthusiasm. By July, the Germans were spent. The Allies counterattacked at the Marne River, and by September, 243,000 U.S. troops joined the French to push the Germans back. The Americans wanted to fight their own line, not just fill in, and they were granted 85 miles of the Western Front. 1.2 million U.S. troops were now on the attack. And then, the guns went silent at 11 a.m. on November 11th, 1918. The 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, and the Allies won. There were small celebrations all over Europe, and large ones as well, as these Greek troops marching with the French through the Arc de Triomphe along the Champs-Élysées in Paris. There would be no parades for the Kaiser of Germany. He fled Germany in the middle of the night, fleeing to neighboring Holland, where he lived in a log cabin for the rest of his life. The damage to Europe had never been seen before, and it seemed a long time before that 2 gunshots had started this whole process in the summer of 1914. Since that time, it had gotten a lot bigger than that in the trenches of the Great War of Europe. 9 million people had died on the battlefield. 9 million. Only 58,000 U.S., although that's a huge number. It's actually around the number we would lose in Vietnam later on. And another 20 million had been wounded. And beyond that, one thing that people don't always talk about is the Spanish flu epidemic that would hit from 1918 to 1919. This would kill another 20 million people just dying from the Spanish flu. Now, originally, the Spanish flu had affected Europe, but a soldier from Kansas brought it with him back home and started an epidemic in the United States. As a result, in addition to the 20 million people that would die from the Spanish flu in Europe, another 550,000 Americans would die from the Spanish flu as well. So the Americans paid a price. They had lost 58,000 on the battlefield, 550,000 to the Spanish flu, and had fought in 2 major battles. But remember, that wasn't their major purpose. It was the prospect of endless fresh troops where they made the difference. Okay, now, at the end of the war, Wilson was at his peak. You can see this in this picture, the sign up here in Paris, Viva Wilson. He was revered by the European people, and his army had made the difference in a 4-year war of attrition. Plus, with all the selling of arms that they had done to Europe, the U.S. was now the mightiest economic nation on earth. Wilson was in a very good position to be the moral leader of the world, as many saw it. But U.S. citizens weren't as enamored with Woodrow Wilson. He'd been popular before when he got elected, but by now Wilson was pushing for the Democratic Party to be the majority in the congressional midterm elections of 1918. He didn't get it. The Republicans still held control of Congress. Also, when Wilson traveled to Europe for the peace talks, many Republicans were extremely upset by that decision. No sitting U.S. president had ever traveled to Europe before, so it seemed like flamboyant grandstanding on Wilson's part, at least in the eyes of the Republicans. The Republicans were also upset that Wilson didn't take Senator Henry Cabot Lodge with him to Europe, or any other Republicans for that matter. Senator Lodge had a Ph.D. and was often considered to be the smartest man in Washington until Wilson had arrived on the scene. But for now, those weren't Wilson's biggest concerns. Wilson had to deal with three nations who had suffered a lot in the war and wanted their cut of the pie during a time that he was trying to promote democracy. The first of these leaders was David Lloyd George, who was the Prime Minister of Great Britain. He's pictured here along with Winston Churchill, a very young Winston Churchill with hair, who would eventually be the Prime Minister of Britain in World War II. France's leader, Georges Clemenceau, was also there, and Italy's leader, Vittorio Orlando. Collectively, these three, along with Wilson, came to be known as the Big Four. And the rest of the Big Four wasn't really all that enamored with Wilson either. They basically found him to be a moralizing professor, especially when they were the ones who had suffered. On the losing side, the Central Powers, you look at all the losses by Germany and Austria-Hungary here, and when you look at the losses just on the Allied side, you realize that they had almost 30 million dead or wounded in a brutal war of attrition that tore Europe up. Comparatively, the U.S. had basically suffered a nosebleed. Why should Wilson drive the peace process? Plus, the other members of the Big Four were also worried that crowds who worshipped Wilson as the champion of democracy, you can see them throwing flowers at his feet here, would soon fall in love with democracy so much that they would want to overthrow their own governments. So Wilson was pretty popular among the European people when he came in, and had a hard time getting along with the others in the Big Four once he was there. During negotiations, Wilson's moralizing offended national leaders across the board, though, and also upset the European people, who felt like he couldn't secure what he had promised. Wilson got into it with France about issues along the new French and German border, got into it with Italy by promising the Yugoslavian people a seaport that the Italians wanted, and got into it with China by allowing Japan to control a part of China despite 30 million Chinese residents already living there. Germany was also upset. It hoped it would be granted a peace treaty that was based on the 14 points, but what they got was harsher, and they blamed Wilson for that. Wilson had been telling people that he wanted Germany as well to be a democracy when the war was over, but they got pounded into dust by Britain and France. For that, the Germans once again blamed Wilson. But Wilson did get what he wanted to some degree, again if you take a look at these maps here. Germany and Austria-Hungary as empires had broken apart, and the result was about 8 different ethnic groups getting their own nations: Poland, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. They had all become their own nations with their own self-determining governments. Wilson should have been somewhat happy about that. And in the end, America, Britain, and the rest of the Big Four came to some fairly bitter compromises about the Treaty of Versailles. The victors got colonies of the defeated nations, and they did agree to be in Wilson's proposed League of Nations. However, the Japanese had felt ignored, and the Italians had felt like they had gotten robbed, and as for Wilson, only 4 of his 14 points were accepted. Overall, Wilson wasn't happy with the results, and neither were the European people. He was now a fallen idol after he'd been welcomed with flowers and praise, he was leaving Europe under much different circumstances. And so Wilson came home and was still happy about one thing that he had accomplished: a union of nations that could possibly ensure world peace. The League of Nations. Of all the things he tried to get done, that one was truly his baby. However, you have to remember that he'd been gone from his post, reveling in European glory, for almost 6 months. He had come back briefly for a short stay to get some things ironed out regarding the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations, but then had turned right around and gone back to Europe. So basically for 6 months he'd been gone and not running the country. Republicans, led by Henry Cabot Lodge, had been waiting for him, and they wanted to stay isolationist. To them, the League of Nations was locking the United States into the biggest alliance in history. Any small fight in Europe that could snowball into something big would drag them in, and with the assassination of Franz Ferdinand ultimately blowing up into the Great War of Europe, they had already seen that that could possibly happen, and maybe even happen again. Anti-Germans in the U.S. felt he should have been tougher on Germany, while some thought it was too tough on Germany. The Irish were mad because the treaty helped Britain, who the Irish couldn't stand. Basically, Wilson faced the ultimate embarrassment. The treaty he had helped to create with his League of Nations was about to be shot down by his country. Now, Wilson could not tolerate that, so he went on a nationwide train tour to promote the treaty, and specifically the League of Nations, and the Republicans followed him at every stop trying to demote the treaty. But after everything that had gone on, the stress finally got to him. If you take a look at the left of this picture here on this slide, this left picture, you'll see that this is Woodrow Wilson in 1913, shortly after he took the oath of office. By 1919, Woodrow Wilson, shortly after the Treaty of Versailles, was a shell of himself. He did not look good, and all of this stress was doing this to him. On his train tour, he eventually reached Pueblo, Colorado, and at that stop, Wilson collapsed from a stroke. He was essentially out of commission for the next 7 months, paralyzed on his left side, after returning to Washington, D.C. Senator Lodge, with no opposition now, fought to preserve U.S. nationalism as well as the Monroe Doctrine, which again said to keep Europe out of the affairs of the Western Hemisphere. And after months of feuding with Woodrow Wilson, the treaty was eventually voted down. And with that, Woodrow Wilson's political career was basically over, and he was reaching near the end of his life. With the election of 1920 approaching, Wilson wanted to run again for a third term after getting elected in 1912 and 1916, but the U.S. had gotten tired of his high and mighty moralizing, and the Democrats didn't think he could win. So they nominated this guy, James Cox, who was running, along with his vice presidential candidate, a very young Franklin D. Roosevelt. Eventually, Cox was defeated in the election by Warren Harding. And the election itself was not close. Harding got 404 Electoral College votes to Cox's 127 Electoral College votes. Now, why would they elect someone like Warren Harding? Well, basically because Harding was the exact opposite of Wilson. He was not a former college professor like Wilson was. He was not a moralizer like Wilson was. He was actually a newspaper journalist from Ohio who'd eventually become a senator, had a lot of friends, and was known for just kind of his backslapping, good-natured demeanor. He's never going to go down in history as one of the greatest presidents, but at that time, he was who the United States wanted. They were tired of the moralizing professor, and they just wanted a Republican who would keep his hands off of things. And so the efforts of Woodrow Wilson to end war forever ultimately failed, and Wilson eventually died in 1924, 5 years after the Paris peace talks. Okay, that's it. Thanks for listening.